At 9 p.m. on July 24th, 2002, the wall gave way. 9 men were working 240 feet underground in the Quecreek Mine in Lincoln Township, Somerset County, Pennsylvania, when the face of their tunnel collapsed inward and water exploded into the corridor. Black, freezing water. It came with the sound of something structural failing, a roar that moved through the coal walls and filled the narrow passage before any of the men could fully process what they were hearing. There was no warning, no gradual seep that might have given them a few seconds to react. The breach was total and immediate. The working face of the one left panel went from solid coal to a rushing channel of floodwater in a matter of moments. In the adjacent section, the two left panel, 9 other miners heard the sound and understood what it meant. They reached a mine phone and called the surface. Then they pushed through the incoming water, some knocked completely off their feet by the force of it, and fought their way toward the shaft that could carry them up. They escaped at around 9:45 p.m. A 911 call reached the surface at 9:53. The 9 men in the one left panel did not get out. They tried. Twice, they pushed into the 4-foot-high connecting tunnels between their section and the cage shaft, the only mechanical exit they had. Both times, the water was already ahead of them. Both routes had been cut off in the minutes it took to make the decision. There was no third option. 18 men had gone into the Quecreek Mine for the evening shift. 9 were now trapped in a flooding section of tunnel 240 feet below a Pennsylvania farm field, with no path to the surface, and no way to know how high the water was going to go. The mine air was roughly 50 degrees. The floodwater was colder. The tunnels were narrow and low, and the corridors between the chambers were tighter still. These men had always worked in a constrained space. Now that space was filling. The roar of the incoming water did not diminish. It continued without pause. And the men began to understand that whatever had been holding it back was now completely gone. So where did 75 million gallons of water come from? The answer was a mistake made decades before any of them set foot in the mine. The Quecreek Mine, operated by Black Wolf Coal Company, was working the upper Kittening coal seam. The men in the one left panel had been advancing their tunnel eastward through the coal, following the seam in a direction the mine's approved plans said was safe. Those plans were based on maps, and the maps were missing something critical. Right next door sat the Saxman Mine, abandoned since the 1950s. For roughly 50 years, groundwater had been quietly filling its sealed chambers, an estimated 75 million gallons of it. None of that appeared on the maps being used to plan the work at Quecreek. The documentation simply didn't show where the Saxman was or how far it reached. The rules required at least 50 feet of solid rock between any working face and a flooded void like that. The miners in the one left panel had advanced to within a few feet of it, and none of them, or anyone on the surface, knew. A tool designed to probe ahead for hidden cavities would have found the void before they reached it. It wasn't on site that night. And the geology made it worse. The Saxman sat slightly higher than the Quecreek workings. So when the wall failed, the water wasn't just seeping. It was driven through, by gravity and by the weight of 75 million gallons pressing against the opening. All of it sought the lowest point it could reach. That point was the tunnel where 9 men were standing. With both exits gone, the 9 retreated deeper into the panel, moving uphill toward the highest ground they could reach, looking for any ceiling the water hadn't taken yet. They found one, a low chamber near the upper end of the panel, where the roof still held a gap of air above the water. They pressed into it. The water followed them up, rising steadily, as if it had nowhere else to be. The gap between the surface of the water and the coal ceiling above their heads shrank by the hour. The air in the pocket was around 50 degrees. The water at their legs was colder. Cold like that, for that long, isn't just uncomfortable. It pulls the heat out of a body until muscle, judgment, and will begin to fail. These men had already worked a full physical shift before the breach. Now they were standing in floodwater, in the dark, with no way to know if anyone was coming. There was no ambiguity about what they were facing, and what they did next shows they understood it completely. Several of them tied themselves together with a length of wire cable. The reasoning was simple and devastating. If the water rose past the ceiling and took them, they didn't want the current carrying their bodies off in different directions through the flooded tunnels. They wanted to be found together. So they fastened the cable among themselves. Some of the men found a dry surface and wrote notes to their families, brief messages that admitted they might not come out. Someone stretched a tarp across one section of the tunnel, a barrier between the men and the black water on the other side. It couldn't hold anything back, but it put a surface between them and the thing they were trying not to look at. In that place, that was not nothing. Imagine the water at your chest, the air thinning. The only sound from above going silent. The roof bolts overhead were anchored in shale that had been soaking up water for hours. And there were sounds coming from the ceiling now, a settling, a shifting, the kind any experienced miner recognizes and doesn't want to hear. The water kept rising. The 911 call at 9:53 set off a response that grew through the night into one of the largest mine rescue operations the country had ever seen. Mine rescue teams, the Pennsylvania Bureau of Deep Mine Safety, and the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration converged on the site within hours. The families of the 9 were sent to a fire hall in Sipesville, about 2 miles away. Around 80 relatives gathered there through the night and the next day. Red Cross counselors moved among them. Those who were there described it as nearly silent, families sitting close, speaking little, waiting for anything at all. On site, the first job was simple to state and urgent to do. Find exactly where the men were, and get air to them before anything else. A GPS survey pinpointed the surface spot above the highest point of the one left panel. At 2:05 a.m. on July 25th, a 6.5-inch borehole started down. A 4-man drill crew pushed through 240 feet of rock in under 2 hours. The moment the bit broke through, rescuers pressed listening equipment to the opening and waited. What they heard changed everything on the surface. Tapping, deliberate, rhythmic. From 240 feet down, rescuers tapped back. The tapping returned. 9 men were alive, and now the surface knew exactly where they were. The signal was heard twice, around 3 a.m. and again around 6 a.m., and answered both times. That same 6.5-inch hole let compressed air be pushed down into the pocket, which met the most immediate threat. Because the water was still rising. The air pocket was still shrinking. Air alone wouldn't bring them out. But it told the rescuers the men were alive, coherent, and exactly where the team thought they were. Now came the hard part. A 36-inch rescue shaft would have to be drilled through that same 240 feet of rock, wide enough to lower a capsule and bring the men up one at a time. Then, a mine ventilation expert proposed something that had never been done in the United States. The idea: seal the small borehole around the airline, then drive the pressure up, using compressed air itself as a barrier, forcing the floodwater back down and holding it below the men while the big shaft was drilled. The calculations were run. The approach was approved. The risk was real. If the seal failed or the pressure was mishandled, the men in the pocket could pay for it. They forced 920 cubic feet of air per minute into the shaft at 90 pounds per square inch. It arrived in the pocket at nearly 200 degrees. The men later described the sound as deafening, physically painful. They were sitting in cold floodwater while superheated air screamed through a 6-inch hole in the rock above them, but the water stopped rising. The air was working. Meanwhile, a second heavy rig had been set up directly above the men and began boring the 36-inch shaft. Officials thought it might take up to 18 hours, if the equipment held. It didn't. Somewhere between 70 and 100 feet down, the large drill bit fractured and broke apart inside the shaft. The drilling stopped. On the surface, that meant hours lost. Rigging lowered to fish out the shattered pieces. A replacement bit found. The whole operation restarted from above the break. All of it was time. For the 9 men below, it was something else. The big drill had been sending vibration through the rock as it worked. Not quite sound, but a presence. Proof that something above was coming for them. When that vibration stopped, they had no idea why. They couldn't know the bit had broken. They couldn't know if it would ever start again. They had been underground for more than 2 days. They sat in the dark and waited for it to come back. By the time the replacement bit was rigged and the big drill resumed, the 9 had been trapped for over 60 hours. Their core temperatures were dropping to a point that was starting to compromise their bodies. The cold water against their legs had never let up. There was no relief from it. After the tapping confirmed their position, communication equipment had been lowered down the 6.5-inch hole, letting the men speak directly with the surface for the first time. Food and water came down the same line. Those exchanges were their only connection to anything outside the pocket. Above ground, the families in Sipesville had been getting updates through each day of drilling. The news of the broken bit had reached them too. The whole operation was unfolding under heavy national coverage, and the pressure on the rescuers was in every decision they made. The big drill advanced through the rock with the new bit, 50 feet, 100, 150. The air system held the water back. The men below waited, and then, in the early morning of July 28th, 77 hours after the wall first gave way, the rescue bore broke through the ceiling of the air pocket. The men heard it before they saw it. A rescue capsule, a metal cylinder just wide enough for one person, was lowered on cables through 240 feet of rock. The first man climbed in. They raised him up. He came out at about 1 a.m. on July 28th. Alive. Into the summer night in Somerset County, where rescue crews and families were waiting. Then the capsule went back down and came back up, one man at a time, each trip taking several minutes through the rock. The 9th and final miner reached the surface before dawn. All 9 men trapped in the one left panel when the Saxman wall gave way. Survived. Some were treated for hypothermia. Every one of them recovered. And the wire cable. The cable several of them had tied among themselves in the dark, so that if they died they would at least be found together. It came back up to the surface with them.